Welcome, GRD132, Typography 1. I just wanted to go over our font comparison quiz that we had, where I gave you that Word document and you had to answer a bunch of questions. And I gave some feedback and I returned them to people. I don't know if everybody's going to read that. And even as I was looking over them, I saw there were some things I wrote that I was like, oh, I should have said this and I should have said that. And every time I write a bunch of feedback, whether it's in the discussion forum or somewhere else, I think I should just record a video. So I'm just recording a video real quick to go over a couple things because visually you'll be able to see it a little bit better than just reading about it. So if I look at this here, I'm not going to go through everything, but the four fonts, you could identify the four fonts. That's not an issue. You know, they're all serif fonts. And then it asks about these elements extending from the beaks. It talks about the cues. It talks about some other things here. So let me just go over a couple things. Now, we were talking about these things on the C's. Remember, these things are the beaks over here. These are the beaks. E's have beaks on them, but you could call these the barbs. When they stick up like that, they're the barbs. So this C has a barb. And number 3, they have barbs on the top and bottom. They have barbs there on their beaks. These don't have barbs on the C's. A couple other things was on the Q's. They have tails at the bottom. They're called a tail. Now, sometimes a tail is what's called on the R, that's called a tail. I know that's kind of interchangeable with a leg. When it's like this, it's kind of like a leg. When that's like a tail. So I usually call it a leg. And at the end, it's called the terminal, and I was using the term finial when I was writing back to people, and it's not really a finial, even though finial can be decorative. I put this here, this thing on the R is a finial. That's really a finial. This could be a swashy kind of curled up serif on the end of the leg, and remember the end of the leg is the terminal, so that's kind of, it has a curled up terminal. This has a flat serif on the terminal. This has kind of a flat serif on the terminal, and this just has kind of a tail. It's almost like the Q has a tail, and the differences between these tails, this has a longer tail, this has a shorter tail, this has a curly tail, this has almost a swashy decorative. When we say swashy, it's kind of a decorative floral kind of shape that's going on there. So this is more of a swashy kind of tail, and it doesn't go through the Q, where this one goes through the Q, almost like a necktie sort of. So I just wanted to point that out. And there was questions about the P. There was one P that the counter did not close. Remember, that's the hole is the counter, and that's the bowl, so the bowl doesn't go all the way around. There's questions about the spur. This is a spur on the G, and down here there's a spur on the G. These don't really have spurs. They're pretty straight. The spur, again, is the goatee kind of thing going on. And also, one thing, I'll just zoom in quick just to point this out. In one of the other things, we talked about cupped fonts. Cupped is kind of down here where it's kind of an arch. That's what we mean by cupped, instead of being flat. So if you ever see that term cupped, we're kind of talking about that. And, you know, here we have rounded serifs. Here we have squared off serifs. You could use the term squared off when it comes to serifs. This font here has very squared off serifs. Their beaks are squared off, where sometimes they'll be pointy or sharp. So these are more kind of blocky in some way. They're squared off instead of coming to a point, where these come to a rounded point. Some of them will come to sharper points. These come to flatter kind of points. And the W's, there's a big issue with W's, and you can see they're all different. Even if you didn't know any terms about the W's, what you could see is that this has 3 kind of, I guess this is the end of the stroke, so it would be 3 terminals. But this thing is really an apex. So where they meet's really an apex, but the way I've seen it described is they're kind of the tops of the terminals. So there's 3 tops of the terminals here, and I still call them serifs, even though technically serifs are on the bottom and beaks are on the side. I still call them serifs because they're basically upside down serifs. So I call them serifs. You could call them tops of the terminals. I wouldn't call them crossbars. Crossbars are like on a letter T, so I don't know if I'd call them crossbars, but these are the tops of the terminal. You can call them serifs. I wouldn't have a problem if you said they're serifs because they look like serifs. They look exactly like the ones on the bottom. So this has 3 serifs where the top of the terminals meet, and even where the apex meet. This only has 2 serifs, and it has 1 apex here where these 2 strokes meet. This one has 3 serifs. It's almost just like this one. So this number 3 is almost just like that, and it's a little bit wider. And then this one has the crossed V's. They cross over the V's, so it actually has 4 serifs, and it has 4 terminals at the top with serifs on them. So I just wanted to point that out because, you know, I know this terminology isn't easy, and it's never clear in any one source. There's different sources, and sometimes they use different terms interchangeably, like I said, with tail and leg and things like that. And sometimes you can't find answers. You might think, well, what is this thing called? And it was hard to find that that's called a finial. and it's hard to find that this is the end of the terminal. There's just things that are hard to find. And the idea is you don't have to know every single term. You just don't want to be ignorant when you use terms. You don't want to call it like the thingy and this and that. You don't want to use real primitive terms. You want to be very clear about what you're talking about. And if there is a term, you're going to try to use it as best as possible. And there were some other things, zooming out. I know this was hard to see. When it came to the lightest font, I saw number 4 as the lightest font, and some people debated that. I would think 3 is the heaviest, and I think 4 is the lightest, considering they're all in the same size. Now, they're all a little bit different in style. Now, as far as the most condensed font, I saw the C, G, and Q as the more condensed letter form out of all of these. Now, it's very close, and, it's hard to say. Now, also, if you look at the P and S, they're the most condensed letter forms of any of the P and S's, and even the R, if you take away the tail or the leg, that's more condensed. So some of these, there were more than one answer. But I saw this as more condensed because I even said, what about the C, G, and Q? So I think they're the more condensed, although this is a very condensed. Although in general, they're all very similar. None of these are really expanded. They're all fairly condensed. So there's always these subtleties, particularly among serif fonts, that I just want you to be aware of, that there are differences. It doesn't matter if you're right or wrong. It just matters that you know that, oh, that has a spur on the G and that doesn't have a spur on the G. Or that has a curly tail on the Q and this doesn't have a curly tail. It just has a tail that kind of sticks out. And this leg is straight, and maybe there's a leg that's kind of curved. As long as you could do that, that helps you identify fonts a little bit better. As long as you say, oh, well, that counter isn't completely closed, that bold doesn't come around all the way and close it up, then you're kind of doing the right thing. So you're all on the right track as far as understanding some of this stuff with the terminology. And the last thing I just wanted to point out that was a little confusing was angle of stress. Remember, angle of stress, I'll zoom in here. It's really the line where it goes from the thin part to the other thin part, where you have this contrast. Now, contrast, this is a modern font, so you have a thin area and a heavier area of the stroke, and it's usually more pronounced in a modern font. There's usually more thinner areas and more thicker areas. There's higher contrast. Not that there isn't contrast with all of them, but it's usually more pronounced in these kind of modern fonts. And the angle of stress is kind of, if you look at these, you don't see it much with C's. You don't even see it much with G's, slightly. But if you look at O's, and I don't have O's here, but with the Q, the best one is the Q. This has the angle of stress, number 4, where you go from the thin side to the thin side. You could see it going across. And if we had an O there, you would see the same kind of thing. And you might see the O's will look pretty much like the Q. They'll follow the Q, but this is the angle of stress, this little line coming here. So I just wanted to point that out and point some of these things out because I'm trying to explain them in the feedback sheets in a Word document. Maybe you'll read it and look at it. Maybe it won't really register. So hopefully just showing a quick video and going over the visuals of it will help a little bit. And I can even clarify or correct anything that I might have typed wrong on your feedback or anything. Like I was using the term finial all over the place and I meant terminal. I was talking about the end of the stroke, meaning the terminal. And this thing is a finial, but there's no real finials to talk about. So if you see finial, I'm talking about the terminal. The ends of the strokes are the terminals. And whenever we say apex, it's this thing here. Just like at the bottom, these are vertexes at the bottom of the W. So there's two vertexes. They all have 2 at the bottom, but their tops change a little bit with the W's. And that's how you can sometimes identify a font. So anyway, that's exercise 2. As I'm going through all these exercises and giving feedback, sometimes I'll record a video because it might make more sense to you to actually see it visually.